Today's vlog prompt is to talk about a memorable trip that you've taken, but I have been travel vlogging for the better part of the summer and I already have a channel full of videos like that, so instead I'm going to take today to talk about what's happening in my home state of Missouri. Quick recap in case you haven't been following this news. On August 9th, a Ferguson, Missouri police officer shot and killed Mike Brown, an unarmed black 18-year-old. The understandably outraged citizens of Ferguson began protesting. Doubling down on the insanity of this situation, the police force turned out to the protests with riot gear. They smoke bombed and fired rubber bullets at protesters. Protesters, journalists, and aldermen were arrested for peaceably assembling and taking pictures. This video isn't really going to be about those particulars, but if you are interested in more information, I will put some links in the description. So first of all, in the way of background information, Ferguson is part of what constitutes the larger metropolitan area of St. Louis. St. Louis metropolitan area is largely a cluster of a bunch of different tinier municipalities, one of which is Ferguson, which is in northern St. Louis County. Just to be clear about all of these constituent parts, you have Ferguson Police Department, whose officer was responsible for the death of Mike Brown. The abhorrent responses to the protests were largely carried out by St. Louis County Police Department. They have now largely been pulled out by the governor, and part of the force that's now going to be part of what's happening on the ground will involve St. Louis City Police Department, but they were not part of the last week of insanity. St. Louis is a very segregated city. On the map that you're looking at right now, the blue dots represent the white population while the green dots represent the black population. That's the city, but the picture doesn't improve much when you pan out to the larger St. Louis metropolitan area. This demographic shift has been intensifying over the years. As an aside, this is also a nationwide phenomenon. Residential segregation was at its lowest in the 80s, but cities all across the country have been gradually resegregating ever since. Link in the video description for the Dissimilarity Index, which is usually what people are referring to when they're talking about residential segregation in the United States. Much of Ferguson's police force and general administration remains much whiter than the actual population. In a town that's 63% black, only 3 out of 53 commissioned police officers are black. So that's the view from Ferguson, but this isn't some incredibly unique phenomenon in spite of efforts to turn this into something that's happening somewhere else. To that end, I've seen people try to lump St. Louis in with the South. All of this is taking place in a larger cultural climate where both the legacy of institutionalized racism and the daily reality of persistent racism means that your race dramatically impacts your experience of living in America. The internet and social media have made it a lot easier for stories like Mike Brown's to gain traction and get noticed, but in addition to the deep tragedy that is the loss of this young man's life, it's also tragic how frighteningly common this is. And both the shooting of Mike Brown and the disastrous treatment of protesters in the wake of it speak to another systemic, nationwide problem. Police forces have become militarized at a staggering rate in post-9/11 America. Officers are patrolling with comparable weaponry to what soldiers are using overseas. They're being trained in such a way that suspects are treated as enemies as opposed to, citizens who are merely suspected of something. This is terrifying, though again, the consequences of this shift are being felt differently. Bodies that are routinely othered, that is, non-white, non-cis, etc., will suffer infinitely greater consequences because the society that marginalizes them has rendered them suspicious for merely breathing. In Ferguson specifically, that 63% black population comprises 86% of traffic stops and 92% of arrests. I've been watching all of these different press conferences, and it's so frustrating to watch officials dance around acknowledging that racism is a big fucking part of what brought us here. I do get the gross politics of it, but when the governor is making statements acknowledging that people are suffering from an old wound without acknowledging, frankly, that that old wound is racism, we are making any sort of real solution impossible. You cannot fix a problem whose existence you refuse to acknowledge. Rhetoric promising to focus on tomorrow is hollow because we are all living in a world profoundly affected by a cumulative sum of actions and events. You cannot do better tomorrow until you take a sobering look in the mirror and acknowledge what you are doing wrong today. A young man died last weekend. I hate to think about how many might have to follow before people in charge start to communicate openly and honestly about why.